So, as coronavirus cases surge across the U.S., the number of first-time unemployment claims are on the rise as well. According to the U.S. Labor Department, an additional 885,000 Americans filed for first-time unemployment benefits last week. That's up 23,000 claims from the previous week's numbers. In addition, 455,000 people applied for aid through the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which helps self-employed and gig workers. These numbers come as more cities and states across the country are enacting additional coronavirus lockdown measures. So Stacy is the Director of Portfolio Strategy at Optimal Capital, and she joins me and Vlad now for more on this week's jobs number. So Francis, new jobs claims rose for the second straight week with 885,000 Americans filing for first-time unemployment benefits. We're now 9 months into this pandemic. So what does this mean for the state of the economy heading into the new year?
Well, sadly, this is new people, right? So the pandemic has been going on since April, and these are people that potentially were holding on, or potentially were able to stay employed, or potentially got their jobs back when we had a reopening, that are now needing unemployment benefits. This is not good news for the long-term trajectory for the labor markets coming out of COVID. This is very dire news, and I'm glad that Congress is finally taking this seriously.
So, as you know, Francis, lawmakers on Capitol Hill are inching closer to terms on a $900 billion coronavirus stimulus package ahead of the holidays, sorely needed. The latest version of this proposal includes a $600 stimulus check for most Americans, which is half of what was provided in the previous round of stimulus checks. Is $600 enough to get the economy moving again, to help millions of people who are suffering?
No, I don't think so, because I think the labor market is worse, and I think the number of people suffering and the degree to which they are suffering is actually worse. But I think that perspective has been occluded by the fact that, a lot of the growth numbers have returned, the stock markets are hitting all-time highs, and I think that really there's a disconnect between what's happening with the political machinations in Congress, what's happening with the markets and the upper 40% who are invested in those assets, and what's actually happening with the lower 60%. And of that 60%, in some research that came out in late 2017 by the great Ray Dalio, only 30% of that lower 60% could withstand a $400 emergency if necessary. So that's how we came into the pandemic. And now this is getting much worse. But I will have to say that we weekly on this show have been telling Congress to take the hot button issues, which sadly are state and local governments, and corporate liability protections out of this and get it passed for the American people by the end of the year. And I'm not going to be so arrogant to say that they're taking my advice, but I'm glad to see that it's happening.
Let me ask you, though, it's really good that this is happening. It looks like they're going to wrap things up by the end of the year. But, the first round of support, the CARES Act, it was passed quickly, and there have been a lot of glitches. There was a dependency on state unemployment systems that were completely overloaded, and so many people just didn't see a check for months and months. This idea of sending out sort of a blanket check, initially $1,200, to anyone making less than a certain amount of money, whether they were employed or not, whether they were impacted by the pandemic or not, has had repercussions. I'm wondering if you are concerned that Congress is not paying enough attention, or at least it doesn't seem like we're hearing a lot about it, on fine-tuning the way they distribute the money to make sure that it is precise and has the most beneficial impact.
Yeah, so again, I think this has gotten a bit lost in the political sort of fracas that we've had this year with the election year. But, if you recall, we've discussed on this show that, actually the administration, the Treasury, Congress, they should have met with governors to see what was really happening statistically internally within the states. It is really tough to tell. For instance, the mortgages that are in forbearance, it's not like the eviction moratorium where it just ends at the end of the year. So some of those lenders have given people up to a year. And so you don't know where those years started and stopped. So statistically, it's really hard to kind of calculate when you think that this data is going to be available and what percentage of the data is actually going to get back to paying and what percentage of the data is actually going to go into a default situation. So we've had these things. We had a lot of abuse occur with the Paycheck Protection Program, as we know, not calling out names, but people took it who didn't need it. And they didn't have some of those provisions. And unfortunately, instead of coming forward and getting another deal done where it was tightened and that was the focus, I think some of the political posturing became the focus. And I do think the people that are lowest and most in dire need, the people that are waiting, in hours and hours and hours of lines for food banks. I know that I spoke with an assemblyman from New York, and he said that some of the food lines are 13 blocks long. I mean, that is just tremendous, particularly with how cold it is. The people who are going to lose their homes, the people who may have just been hanging on to their homes, who are going to lose their unemployment benefits. So this should be the focus, and I think that we have an opportunity, when the Senate gets determined and when the new administration comes in, to really hone in on statistically what's happening in different states, because what's happening in New York is so different than what's happening in Idaho versus Florida versus Texas versus, Colorado, what have you. So I think that needs to be the focus, because anytime you cannot get any kind of a statistical read on something and you're not looking at that data and you're just looking at the national data, you're going to have people in states that fall behind.
Frances, consumer spending is down heading into the holidays. Retail sales dropped more than a point in the month of November. We're in the midst of this pandemic. So what does this mean for the state of the retail industry? Is it because the people are suffering economically? In other words, people have lost jobs, people are not working, the gig economy is down? Or is it because, people are just not spending? I mean, people aren't taking vacations, for example.
Well, I think it's a bit of a combination. I think certainly there are people who are just not going to have a Christmas this year, unfortunately, and I think that that's tremendously sad. I think there's also sort of this COVID fatigue, and people are just sort of enduring what's happening. And you're not, I think sometimes, maybe this is just true for me, but I think sometimes, I'm not going to see all the people at Christmas parties this year and all the people that I might run around at the last minute and get gifts. I mean, it's like you're running around trying to find everybody's addresses, and some people aren't at their homes, they're at their second homes, or they're renting a home, or it's just been very complicated. So I think there's some of that going on. And I also just think that, ever since COVID started, you had a record amount of savings in the system, because people are like, wow, you really should save for a rainy day, and we don't know what's going to happen, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So I think there's an uptick in savings, and I think that there's just a general, this year's unusual. We've come to accept it. And I think the Christmas spirit is not fully in bloom. As far as the impact coming out of it, again, less sales, it's going to eventually affect these companies and earnings and growth. But all of these things have such a lagging effect. But I think in the long term, it's going to just be that much harder to come out of COVID when certain areas of the economy, like retail, have this massive ding that is highly unusual.
A lot of people are going to see their unemployment benefits also expire, just as much as it is, important that we see another stimulus package extending unemployment benefits. Is that something that's also crucial as well?
Definitely. And again, statistically, we're missing a lot of data, but we don't know what people are using that money to, for, essentially. And I know that earlier on, when the original $600 a week expired, some of the criticism around that was people were using that not to get jobs. I think as this has drug on and more businesses, particularly small businesses, are failing, I think that that's probably statistically no longer the case. And we just don't know how many people are using that for what little shopping they're doing this year, or how many people are buying food, or how many people are saving up for when they have to pay their rent, or they have to pay their student loans and all of these lump sum payments become due. So because we don't have a statistical understanding of that, we're being so careful about the virus, and we're counting every life lost as sort of a personal failure, a governmental failure. And I think we need to also look at that with, if somebody loses their home, or somebody that was feeding themselves is now in a food bank line, that should be a personal failure for our government and our Congress and their delays and the political machinations. And we have to start taking that just as seriously as we're taking the virus.
Excellent point. Frances, always great to have you. Thank you so much for your analysis. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Have a great one.
You too.